Hey there everybody, Sage Popham here again, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and welcome to another episode of The Plant Path. And you know, I really love it when the Latin name of a plant isn't just, named after the person that named it or some superfluous name, but it actually gives you a little insight into the nature of the plant. And the remedy that I'm going to share with you today is one that I personally really love the Latin name of because I'm so steeped in the Western alchemical tradition and spagyric herbal pharmacy that how could I not fall totally in love with Alchemilla vulgaris. So we're going to be heading on over to our little patch of ladies mantle here and sharing a little bit about some of the properties of this plant today. All right, so here we are with our humble little patch of ladies mantle that actually is less humble than it used to be. This is one of those plants that does really grow and spread over the years as it continuously comes back. But share a little bit about some of the properties here of ladies mantle. So its Latin name is Alchemilla vulgaris, which I really love because Alchemilla is basically means the little alchemist. And one of the reasons that it's postulated that it has that name is the unique relationship of this plant to water. And these leaves kind of form this cup shape in which the dew tends to collect, or rainwater and dew collects into kind of the central part where the stem attaches to the leaf, and you see these little droplets of water, and it's kind of postulated that the plant in a way is almost like distilling the water. It's like lifting it up. The water doesn't just kind of roll off, but the water just kind of is held in the kind of cup shape of this plant. And of course the cup shape in esoteric traditions has a very strong association with the water element, such as the suit of cups in the tarot. But the main part of the plant uses the aerial parts, predominantly the leaf. And what we see with the flavor of ladies mantle is that this is primarily an astringent plant, a property that it shares with a lot of its fellow Rosaceae family relatives. And it is predominantly astringent, and that indicates the presence of tannins, which are constituents that have a tendency to basically knit together proteins. They have a tightening, binding effect upon tissues. And traditionally, tannin-rich plants were used to tan hides, right? Hence the name tannins. But they do the same thing within our body as well. And so when we're looking at some of the predominant actions of ladies mantle, I would say kind of the most important one here is that it's an astringent, and astringency is a taste as well as an action in Western herbal medicine. And so, well, in other systems of herbal medicine too. So what we see is that the predominant property of this plant is as an astringent. So it's going to take tissues that are overly lax, right? Overly loose and lax and kind of weak and apathetic. Astringents are typically used to help restrain the excess flow of fluids out of the body. So that can be things like excess sweating, excess urination, just excess secretions, fluids leaving the body. That can be various forms of like discharges as well. We would use it for things like that, and from a TCM perspective of like what they might consider like a quote, like a leaky Jing gate, which is the Jing is kind of that core root vitality of the system that's held within the kidneys, the Chinese kidneys that is, which is a bit different than just our anatomical kidneys. But when it's leaky, it's kind of this excess urination, excess flow. And typically like an astringent plant is going to help to bind and hold those fluids in place. The other thing that we see with astringents is they're typically used for, and especially ladies mantle here, is when tissues become overly lax and kind of lose their structural tone. And this is very common in like prolapsed organs. This plant is very specific for things like uterine prolapse, post-childbirth, when tissues have become like excessively stretched and then they lose their tone and they're kind of weak and flabby in a way. And so it helps to tighten and bind those tissues. So it's used for a lot of, connective tissue weakness and kind of overextension, used commonly for things like hernias, but especially used for the female reproductive system. And this is really kind of what I see as one of the core affinities of Ladies' Mantle is for the female reproductive system, especially for the uterus. This is a remedy that has really been used to tighten and bind and contract the uterus, as I said, for prolapsed uterus, for things like vaginal discharge, what we would refer to as like leukorrhea, and that is kind of one of the main uses that I tend to think of with this plant. But one of the other affinities that we see that it has is for specifically for the venous side of circulation. And that is because the veins, when your heart's pumping and blood's moving through your vasculature, the arteries and the arterioles kind of expand and contract with the beating of the heart, and that helps to move the flow of the blood through the vasculature. But once that blood, hits capillary beds, it goes to extracellular fluids, and then we have that return blood flow back to the heart. That's done through the veins. And the veins are much more passive in their activity than the arterial side of circulation. And because often, all that blood is moving back to the heart, well, our heart's up here, majority of our body is below the heart. And so in order for that blood to get back to the heart, it's moving against gravity in, a channel that doesn't kind of expand and contract like the arterial half of circulation. And so I explain that because venous blood tends to stagnate much easier. And when the venous side of circulation becomes relaxed, right, overly dilated, the blood is going to be much more likely to pool. And this is where we see things like varicose veins, spider veins, just poor venous circulation. And you can commonly see that, and it's actually one of the specific indications for Ladies' Mantle from William Lassassier, which is something that I learned. I didn't have a chance to study with William directly, but studied with Matthew Wood quite a bit, who was a student of William. And he also mentions this kind of specific indication of like sensitive women with pale skin and very visible veins. Like you can see kind of that blue coloration of the veins under the skin. Like Matthew always kind of explained as like the skin almost seems like kind of translucent almost, like you can really see through into the venous side of circulation. And so that's one of the things that we see with Ladies' Mantle here is really supporting that relaxed state in the venous system, in the female reproductive system, but it will also be working in the digestive system as another affinity. So anytime we see a relaxed state in the intestinal tract, things like leaky gut syndrome or kind of hyperpermeable hyperpermeable intestinal membrane, right? AKA leaky gut syndrome. Trying to say the fancy word for it, but leaky gut's a little easier to say sometimes. And then mentioning like hernias, which oftentimes is a laxity in the connective tissue. And that wound healing property, that astringent property internal in the gut is also topically applicable, right? So just as a very simple vulnerary, pretty much any herb that I'm aware of with an astringent property can be used topically. as a vulnerary, and not only through binding the tissues together and helping the wound to close more quickly, but it's very common for tannins to also have an inflammation modulating property, so helping to kind of reduce inflammation, reduce irritation. That's very common for Rosaceae plants to have a little bit of a cooling effect. This plant is said to have some salicylates in there, which you can kind of taste a little bit. There is like a little undertone of almost like, I guess, a little bit of bitterness to the plant. I think the astringency kind of overpowers that, but there are some salicylates present, which of course are the base compound, from which aspirin is derived, and thus having some inflammation modulating properties. Some state that the salicylates also have a little bit of a blood thinning property. So kind of thinking back to that venous circulation. Well, if you've got stagnant blood in the veins and you're toning the vein and you're maybe thinning the blood a little bit, that blood's going to be able to move through the circulation a little bit better. So that wound topically also can translate into being supportive for ulceration in the stomach, in the intestines. Of course, that can be very serious, so you got to be a little bit careful if you're working with like really like severely bleeding ulcers. That's usually a trip to the hospital. And the other thing that Matthew's always talked about with ladies' mantle is for like torn tissues, like perforations, like specifically like if people get like a perforated eardrum, or they get tears in connective tissues, or again, like ulceration would probably be kind of a part of that as well. Leaky gut would be a part of that as well. Wounds, of course, would be a part of that as well. So those are kind of some of the main actions and affinities that I tend to think of in relationship to ladies' mantle. And then, on the energetic level, as an inflammation modulating plant and being in the Rosaceae, it is going to have a cooling energetic, so it's going to be really nice for kind of inflamed, irritable tissues. And I kind of always see that on the signature of the plant. Like if you look really, really closely at the tips, of the leaves, they kind of have this serrated leaf margin, but the tips of them kind of have this pinkish red coloration to it. They come to a really sharp point, which to me sometimes can be a signature of like heat or aggravation or irritation in the tissues. So we do see that cooling property here. And of course, as an astringent, it will be drying. So it's going to restrain the excessive outflow of fluids, which and anybody that's ever, if you ever had a really strong cup of green tea or eaten a banana that's a little too green, kind of puckers your cheeks up, dries out the salivary secretions in your mouth. It's because it's drying fluids, and so it will have a drying effect. And then in terms of its influence on tissue tone, it's tonifying, right? It's tonic, it's an astringent, so it increases the tone of the tissue. And so that all translates to an influence on what we, as I was kind of mentioning earlier, it's kind of hard to talk about tannins and astringents without already referring to the relaxed tissue state, right? So that Matthew typically refers to it as the damp relaxation tissue state, primarily because when a tissue is relaxed, there tends to be outflow of fluids, and that can either be fluids leaving the body, excessive urination, excessive sweating, discharge, whether that's like nocturnal emissions or whether that's leukorrhea, things like that. And then the other side of that, though, can be fluids leaking to inappropriate parts of the body, right? So that would be like the varicose vein example is another really great example of the damp relaxation tissue state. That blood is pooling and stagnating and kind of resting in areas where it shouldn't be resting. So the damp relaxation tissue state is useful to kind of juxtapose next to the damp stagnation tissue state, because one is water or fluids flowing into areas they shouldn't flow, and the other is fluids stagnating. And so actually varicose veins is kind of a combination of both. You get relaxed tissues that lead to fluids stagnating. Edema could be another really good example of that. That's typically a relaxed state. Sometimes edema can be due to some different causes, but it can be due to a relaxed tissue state, fluids leaking into the extracellular spaces and accumulating and then ultimately stagnating. So then to translate that into kind of how this plant will operate upon the doshas of Ayurveda, this will predominantly be an aggravating plant to the Vata dosha because it is cooling, because it is drying, and because it is tonifying. And Vata is typically already cold and already dry and already hypertonic or tense. We can see it can be useful for treating an excess of Pitta because they tend to be hot and damp, but more damp in the form of oils, but this will help to cool down some of the excess heat of Pitta. But what we really see predominantly here is this is a plant that's really best used to address the Kapha dosha. And this is because Kapha is damp and heavy and relaxed. So Kapha is going to be more prone to relaxed tissue states, prolapse, kind of weakness within the tissues, and excessive dampness. So Ladies' Mantle is going to help restrain those fluids from overflowing, drying up excess fluids, and kind of tightening and binding up that relaxed nature of Kapha. So yeah, these are some of the main kind of core medicinal properties that I tend to think of in regards to Ladies' Mantle. It is just a really wonderful plant to have around. I really love its nature and especially in the way that I feel a personal affinity for this plant because I practice plant-based alchemy, and the plant's name is Alchemilla, the little alchemist, and this was a plant revered by the alchemists. And because in alchemy there's certain waterworks that are done that specifically relate to dew. There's ways they say that dew has a very magical property to it because it's the moisture that's collecting on the earth. It's not from raining, it's just that natural moisture. They say there's a central fire in the center of the earth that's radiating heat out, and that heat of the earth radiates out, and when it hits that cool air that meets in the middle, and that water kind of collects and condenses. So there's times when they say that then that dew collects the celestial fire. And so it's a very special form of water used in alchemical works. And there's old drawings of people doing dew work where they kind of put these forest stakes out on the ground in the field at certain times of year. Typically around this time, it's springtime here, and tying a sheet to those stakes, so it's just sitting a little bit off the ground, and then you go out there in the early morning and you wring that dew out and you collect all of that dew, and then typically use that for special alchemical works where special waters are involved. And that's one of the cool things I love about alchemy, is every kind of detail of the medicine making process is looked at, not just like, just get some water out of the tap, or just pour some alcohol over it, but they're really thinking about what's the nature of that water? Where did that alcohol come from? What's the nature of that alcohol? What plant is it from? When was it distilled? Etc. So that's kind of one of the special things about alchemy that I love, and one of the reasons why I really love this plant and its relationship to the water element, and that kind of brings us to what I refer to as the energetic architecture of this plant, or how it relates to, the archetypal forces of nature. And so in accordance to the elements, this is a water element plant, as you might assume after all that talk about water and dew. This plant is operating on dampness in the body. It's operating on the water element organs of the body predominantly, right? It kind of has an affinity. I tend to talk about affinity in terms of specific organs, but we can also just think of areas of the body, right? Like some herbs have a very pectoral affinity. They just work up, they move up here. Some of them work deep, some of them work superficially, some of them work, better for circulation down into the legs, some of them up into the head, right? So that's another way of thinking of affinity. And with Ladies' Mantle, I really see it as kind of working in that pelvic region. region, and hence it's very good for the kidneys, which govern the water element, the uterus, which is governed by the water element, and the kind of those lower parts of circulation, specifically in the veins. So it kind of has this lower area affinity, and really working strongly on those water element organs and parts of the body, as well as the water element tissue state with the damp relaxation pattern. And then considering its planetary correlation, I tend to think of Lady's Mantle as being governed by Venus. Many Venusian plants tend to, like, Venus is the great relaxant, right? So Venus, its property commonly relaxes things, but we look at the lens of these archetypal influence on kind of on the spectrum of sympathy and antipathy. So whereas many Venusian plants tend to kind of relax your system and make you feel more calm, many of them are antispasmodics, some of them are the opposite of that, right? And so that's what we see with Lady's Mantle, is that it's a Venus plant that treats a Venus imbalance, being that relaxed tissue state. So it's used for an excess of Venus in the body, right? The Venus organ systems tend to be the female reproductive system, the kidneys and urinary tract. And then we have Venus being that relaxant virtue. When it's in excess within a system, it tends to create relaxation within the tissues. Venus also rules the venous side of circulation. So there's another correlation there. So multiple layers of correspondence to Venus, and it's just a lovely plant too in the way its texture is specifically, like, it's super soft, right? It's a really, really soft plant, and that to me also is kind of an indication. It's just beautiful, you know, it's a lovely plant. Many Rosaceae plants tend to be governed by Venus. And then we could say it's sub-ruled by the moon, you know, it does have kind of like a little bit of that softer, silvery appearance to the green in the leaves. And of course, the moon governing, you know, the whole water economy within the system. There is some correlation there as well. But I really predominantly tend to consider this a Venusian plant.
So just to add on here what Sage was talking about, I'll just share a little bit about my experience with Lady's Mantle. And as you can see, the signature of the plant, how the leaves have that kind of cup shape, and then how they hold all that water and the dew that collects in there, being just such a clear signature for the womb. I've worked with this plant a lot to also help support women on their reproductive systems and in their womb, and kind of on that emotional and psycho-spiritual level, working with the plant for womb cleansing. Is that water element is really strong and with this plant. You can see the way it holds water and can help to kind of move some of that stagnation or trauma or things that are maybe held in the womb. That I've used it in herbal baths for womb cleansing, and just absolutely love this plant. And I've also heard other herbalists talk about it in a way that it also kind of surrounds one in like a mantle of protection, that there's kind of this protective quality of this plant for sensitive and sensitive people. And so it's a good plant that I love a lot. As far as growing this plant, this is a super easy plant to grow, at least in the temperate northwest climates where I live. And being a native plant of Europe, it's we have a similar kind of climate here where we are in the Pacific Northwest, and it's this herb is this actual plant right here that's in front of me. I've been carrying along pieces of it for about like 15 years. I originally got a clump of Lady's Mantle, dug it up out of my first herb teacher's garden and planted it in my mom's garden, and it just grew and took over and dug up a chunk and brought it with me as I moved. And so this clump here is from from that original plant that I dug up out of my herb teacher garden about 15 years ago. And I've just been bringing it with me and digging it up, and then here we are, and it just loves to keep growing. I have grown it in the full sun right here. It's full sun and it's doing really well. And I also have clumps growing in the shade, and it's doing well in the shade too. So this herb is pretty resilient and pretty easy to grow. It is one that I have not had success with growing by seed very well. I've tried a couple times, and it's a light dependent germinator, and I don't know why it hasn't quite worked for me growing it from seed, but the seeds have a really short lifespan, so maybe that the seed I had was too old, but that if you do try it from seed, just remember that it does need to be able to have exposure to the light to be able to germinate. So when we went to Norway to see visit our homeland and see where our family was from, and we got to see lady's mantle growing in its native habitat, which was just such a joy for me, having a relationship with this plant for so many years, and then getting to meet it in its own native wild habitat. And we saw it growing along streams by the water and out, in shady, kind of moist areas. And then I was actually really surprised. I saw it when we were up hiking in the mountains, and there was lady's mantle just covering the entire the land. It was mixed in with wild blueberries, and it was just in this really harsh, kind of cold, windy environment where it reminded me of just kind of like a tundra almost. and they're just these little lady's mantles plants just covering the whole landscape. And so it's a really hardy herb, so it's really cool to see it in just these different environments, on the lush creek in the woods, and then up in the mountains, and this windswept landscape with those high mountain blueberries. And it was just really happy in all of those environments. So it's to me special just having connections with those plants, that there's obviously a deep ancestral relationship, that our ancestors have relationships for thousands and thousands of years. And so I love growing those plants from where my people are from. And one of the things I've noticed, if you do want to spread this plant, if you can find someone who has it in their garden and dig it up, and you can dig up a little chunk of it, and then it'll eventually keep spreading, and you can keep digging up more chunks and move it around your garden. And you can really see the relationship that it has to. I noticed when I was digging it up, I could see how it looks just like, grows like strawberries, kind of has those similar structure, and those that same family of plants. And so yeah, it's an easy one to grow, and I definitely encourage you to just have it around, and especially get out early in the morning where you can see the dew collecting all around it, and just it has a magical quality to it. So I hope you get to deepen your relationship with this plant, grow it in your garden, and in a pot, or just have it around. It's a good medicine to have around.
So that's just a little bit about lady's mantle today. Hopefully you learned something good about this plant. We're actually going to be, it's Friday, so it's Venus Day here out on the farm, and we're going to be harvesting this lady's mantle and taking it into the lab to prepare it as a spagyric. Sometimes a lot of people might prefer to harvest it, before it's going into flower. But I find that the astringency and the tannin content is still really nice, even when it's gone to flower. This literally just started to flower in the last day or two. And so I think this is a really prime time to harvest. There's also just kind of like that energetic quality or spiritual quality of having the flower in the medicine that I really like. And some plants you really want to harvest before they go to flower. Things like nettle leaf, definitely get it before it flowers. Horsetail, you really got to get it before it gets too low. But this is one of those herbs where, some herbalists might really prefer it before it goes to flower, but I have been working with this plant for a really long time and making medicine out of it for a long time, and I haven't really noticed a significant difference in terms of its potency. Generally, I prefer to prepare plants fresh. Because this is a tannin-rich plant, it does yield well to more of a less concentrated alcohol. So typically, if you're preparing it dried, tannin-rich plants, I say kind of like a 30-ish% alcohol is usually good. Because we're preparing this fresh, we'll be bumping that alcohol percentage up probably to around 50% or so, depending on how damp it is. We'll take it in and kind of see what the moisture content is and adjust our alcohol percentage from there. And I really love it in tincture form. It can be prepared as a tea, though tannin-rich herbs in teas sometimes are a little unpleasant, and if you make them too strong, they can be a little upsetting to the stomach. But it's not too disagreeable as a tea, but I really prefer it as a tincture. And this is just a really wonderful remedy to have around and a lovely plant to have in the garden. And just want to say thank you so much for joining me here. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. It actually really helps to support the channel, especially on YouTube, for people to watch to the end all the way. So thanks very much for joining me here all the way to the end. If you're listening on the podcast or watching this content anywhere other than our website, check us out over at evolutionaryherbalism.com, where we've got tons of free content over there for you. And if you want to do a little something to support the channel, just hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and follow us on our various channels across the interwebs. And it helps us to continue to be able to produce and share free content with the herbal community. So once again, thanks so much for joining me here. And until the next one, take care and be well.